Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see me. And it's my privilege as the Chief Executive of Coram to welcome you today to this Coram Institute for Children discussion and book launch opportunity. The Coram Institute for Children, it has a series of forums to enable exchange and dissemination of research for policy and practice to take insight into impact for children. It has at its heart participatory research methods and the voice of children and young people in the pursuit of their rights. And it brings together two research teams, research in impact and evaluation, which is focused on the work in the UK, and Coram International, which is hosting today, which worked in 30 countries last year and is honoured and proud to partner with the UN and NGOs around the world. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ben Perks today, who's a long collaborator and friend, and to hear all that he has to say on the occasion of the launch of his new book. And it is with that that I hand over to Awaz Raoof from Coram International, part of the Coram Institute, in order to host you for today. I hope you have an excellent discussion.
Thanks very much, Carol, and welcome to all our participants online to this webinar on preventing and responding to child trauma implications for public policy reform. As Carol says, my name is Awaz Raoof, and I am the Deputy Director of Coram International and a member of the Coram Institute for Children. And I have the pleasure of chairing this webinar today. And we are specially privileged to welcome our keynote speaker, Benjamin Perks, to discuss the implications of his new fantastic book, Trauma Proof: Healing, Attachment and the Science of Prevention. So Ben works for the UN in New York, where he campaigns on human rights and child development. He is a leading global advocate on issues related to child poverty, education, mental health, early childhood development, and preventing violence against children. He is a senior fellow at the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and an associate member of the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. And this is where I slightly embarrass Ben. Trauma Proof has been described as visionary, an immersive journey, and a defining work on childhood adversity. And it takes us through the science of childhood trauma, drawing upon both global research and a series of impactful human stories to make the case for a global child development revolution to combat endemic child trauma. And to discuss how we can achieve this in practice, Ben is joined by our very own Professor Dame Carolyn Hamilton, who is Director of Coram International and International Research Lead at the Coram Institute for Children. Carolyn is an internationally known human rights and child rights lawyer and researcher. Having served as a senior legal advisor to the Children's Commissioner and as the Children and Families Commissioner herself, Carolyn publishes research and advises governments, the UN and NGOs on legal and policy reform to protect and promote children's rights. And she has led Coram International in completing projects in almost 100 countries around the world. And we are thrilled to have both Ben and Carolyn join us for this webinar. During the presentations and discussions, we invite you, our online participants, to drop any questions you may have for the panel in the chat, and we will try our best to go through them. And so without further ado, it's my privilege to pass on to our keynote speaker, Benjamin Perks. Over to you, Ben. Sorry, Ben, you're on mute, I think.
Thank you, Awaz and Carolyn and colleagues. It's such a pleasure to join the Coram today. I'm so appreciative of all of your work and obviously have a long-standing partnership with you. So I was thrilled when you invited me to talk today about trauma proof. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book. When I first went to my agent and the publisher to talk about the book, I said I have three big ideas. The first one is that the attachment between a parent and child, the bond, the relationship, is the greatest economic and social asset any society has because it's the foundation of all learning and human development. Conversely, when it's absent, when parent-child attachment is absent, in the aggregate, it's our biggest, costliest, and least talked about social and public health problem. However, and my third point, we are the first generation in history who have the knowledge, the capability, the resources, and the reach to create a world in which every child grows up safe and loved, where we solve this public health problem. And it is one of the major breakthrough pieces of science of our generation is the idea that we can really dramatically reduce and prevent child trauma. So when I told this story to the agent and my publisher, they said, "We love that. That's fantastic. But we think you've got one more story to tell, and we'd like you to feature that in the book." And that is a conversation about the way that people that have experienced child trauma, sorry, I need to go back. I've gone one forward. The way that people who experience child trauma, which is actually potentially more than half of us, can heal at any age. And this came from my own story of having come from a children's home background, but having gone through university and my master's and having a UN career and finding myself at some point at a conference on deinstitutionalization and hearing Professor Kevin Brown of Nottingham University, some of you would know him, describe the impact of attachment for kids that were institutionalized on their adult emotional world as they go through life. And I identified with this very much, and I began a period of healing, and those that have read the book know about this. And when I finally arrived at a place where I had what I think psychologists would call a earned secure attachment, I thought, if I can heal from this, as somebody who's worked on public health campaigns on child survival, can we not do this at scale? And I think that's what started the idea maybe 10 years ago for the book. And so the agent and the publisher in particular, wanted me to feature stories of my own story and stories of people like me who had, in different parts of the world, experienced different types of child trauma and how they tried to address it in their lives. So that's also a feature of the book. So coming back to my three big ideas, why is early attachment, the best asset we have? Well, 85% of brain development, as we all know, is happening in the last few months of pregnancy and the first few years of life. Children are biologically programmed to seek a deep attachment and connection with a primary caregiver and others. Children are born recognizing the voice of their mother. Children are not born and then form relationships. Children are born into relationships. But what happens when a parent isn't able to respond to that need? And I'll come back to that later, because often that inability to respond is unintentional and automatic and stems from the person's own childhood or from postnatal depression or other things. So I'm going to come back to that more in a bit. But as children go through those early years, they're asking 100 questions an hour, some scientists suggest, first by pointing and babbling, and all of us who are parents know this, and then by words and language, and eventually around the age of 3, these things switch from what and when to how and why. And this is the essence of child development, the natural rhythm of child development, learning through play and through relationships. But often children are deprived of optimum learning because those relationships are absent. So for a secure attachment, every child needs to feel secure in themselves, their internal world, self-confidence, that they have belonging, that they are connected, that their emotions matter and that they matter. They need to feel physically safe, that there is always a safe haven to return to as they go out and explore the world. They need to feel seen, that their name is known, that they are recognized and understood within their family and their community. And fourthly, and this comes from the neurobiology, soothed, because when children experience bad things, it activates the stress response system, and it is soothing that calms the stress response system. But if nobody to soothe the child, tolerable or positive stress can become toxic stress over time. And often we talk about ending corporal punishment or preventing physical violence. But for children, safety is not just the absence of physical violence, it is the presence of love because of that biological imperative to form a deep bond with a parent. We now know, and I've only learned this over the last couple of decades really, that we developed a language around adverse childhood experiences, 10 things that happen inside the home. There's lots of discussion about things that happen outside the home, like poverty and conflict, but these are things that happen inside the home that reduce the connection between the parent and the child and prevent the child from feeling safe, loved, and connected. And we now know that the more adverse child experiences a child has, the more risk they have for almost every well-being indicator and every form of social risk that exists. Children who have more adverse child experiences have higher risk for all of these things, and it's a step response relationship. Somebody who has four adverse child experiences is more vulnerable to all of those things than somebody who had 2, who's more vulnerable than somebody who had 0. So the population research now across, I think, over 40 countries tells us about the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences. Why is there a link between adverse childhood experiences and negative life outcomes? There are multiple reasons related to attachment, but Harvard Center for the Developing Child talks about the neurobiological impact of adversity by looking at stress. So every child needs to have positive stress to learn, to grow, and to flourish. We have a major problem here in the United States because some pharmaceutical companies and others try to convince parents that children should have no anxiety at all, that all anxiety is a mental health problem. But children need to have anxiety and stress in proportion to the situation. When it's out of proportion to the situation, then we recognize it as a mental health problem. Many children live in situations where there is gang violence, where there is conflict, where there is crushing poverty. But the stress of that is managed because the child is secure, safe, seen, and soothed. So the tolerable stress doesn't leave a lasting trauma in itself. There will be other impacts of inequality or other problems, but the thing remains tolerable stress. Toxic stress is when there is nobody to soothe the child from the pain that they experience, nobody to make them feel loved, or when the parent themselves is the source of the stress. It is bad experiences without the buffer of a parent or primary caregiver. And that has an impact on all of the evolving neurobiological systems of the child. And this is why people like Nadine Burke-Harris suggest that we have, and the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, we have this clear link between adverse childhood experience, clear correlation, and negative life outcomes. So I want to talk about prevalence for a moment. For most of recent history, we've thought about child protection in terms of 2 to 3% or less in high-income countries who are affected, or in care or on the child protection register or in conflict with the law. But what we now see from the adverse child experience research is that below that visible tip is a huge iceberg, and 13% of children have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. They're the ones that are particularly at risk for all of the things that I just showed. We also know that from observational research that about 40 to 45% of children are experiencing insecure attachment. In research across 37 different countries, 57% of adults reported one adverse childhood experience. And then when UNICEF measures physical or verbal violent discipline across countries, it's actually got a prevalence of 80% in the global south. So when we talk about the prevalence of adversity, maltreatment, neglect, abuse, we really are in the midst of a much greater understanding that there's greater prevalence than we ever previously thought. So if you look at a classroom, this is from New York State, which has got a slightly higher incidence of ACE. This is what the classroom looks like in terms of ACE's distribution in a normal childhood population. And I think that's pretty alarming for people seeing that for the first time. I showed all of those risks before, but I just want to zoom in on some of the things that happen, particularly in adolescence, children reaching adolescence with adverse childhood experiences. And this is data from the National Health System in Wales, which recognises, and I think they're the 14 and the 15 numbers to the left. This is one of the best pieces of evidence on the intergenerational nature of violence. When we look at repeat offenders who begin chronic repeat serious offenders, there's a 90% prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in many parts of the world, including here in the United States and the United Kingdom. When we look at things like trafficking, whether it's grooming gangs in the north of the UK, for example, that have had a lot of attention recently, or the Epstein-Maxwell case, they always go after children with high ACEs, as do county lines and all of that. And I know this because I'm from a children's home. We were always the ones that organised crime groups would target for recruitment many decades ago, and the problem still exists. So I'm just going to try and get to my next slide. All of this and all of the things I showed in the prior slide, including the health outcomes, are very conservatively, according to the UN Special Representative, the Secretary General of Violence Against Children, costs around 11% of GDP. And that doesn't include the lost productivity from child trauma. Why? And I apologize for this slide. I know it's hideous. This is what happens when you get a middle-aged man with no aesthetic capability at all to try and do a slide with AI. This is supposed to represent the elephant in the world's living room, which is one of the chapter titles, as people would know. But it's asking the question, if all of this is so widespread and costly, why isn't it a priority? Well, it's hidden in plain sight. And we think it's really important to talk about it really difficult to talk about this in families, in communities, in relationships, but also in the Parliament and the European Council and the UN and everywhere else, because it's a taboo, and it has been for most of our history. And for all of our history, it's become less of a taboo recently, and there are many reasons it's a taboo, but I want to share just 3 of them. The first is chronic shame. The idea that when you experience child trauma or maltreatment, that there's something wrong with you, and that it's your fault, and that embeds in you as a child and often carries throughout life. Well, if 50% of people experience some form of child trauma, 50% of people may be affected by chronic shame, and that's not a them problem, that's an us problem, and it's a Parliament and a public policy challenge. Secondly, is social stigma. We very recently in Germany and Turkey were able to see research where they actually ask people about how they feel about speaking to people about childhood trauma experiences compared to other forms of trauma like road accidents or chronic health. And people really struggle to talk about it. It's because of a stigma around the issue. And it's very likely statistically to be people that experienced it themselves that carry a stigma towards others that may disclose it. And that's a real challenge. And thirdly is traumatic memory, because child maltreatment is so overwhelming. Even the sense of just not being loved or being yelled at is so overwhelming for children. They suppress it, and it often stays suppressed within their memories. So when they interviewed victims of grooming or trafficking gangs, they recognized they couldn't give a chronological history of what happened. And then Nazia, I can't remember the last name, the lead prosecutor for the grooming gangs in the north of England, who's really, I think, very much a hero in this area, said that in the end, took into account traumatic memory when they were listening to the testimony of girls of the trafficking, because the defense would try to discredit them by pointing to the absence of a chronological historical testimony from the victims. Also, we have to remember that child development has been surrounded by myth for a very long time, and as a species, for much of our history, we've been paranoid about keeping children safe from harm, disease, war. And so we have all these myths that are primarily about scaring children into not doing bad things, spare the rod, seen, not heard. And then there's also a lot of misunderstanding about child development. When couples are arguing, they may say, well, we're going to stop when he's old enough to understand, without really understanding that the adversity, it's understood from the child picks up the conflict in the house, for example, from the day that they're born. It affects the body, keeps the score, as Bessel van der Kolk says. So I'm calling for a child development revolution. Thank you for that, Awaz. And people think I'm crazy when I talk about a child development revolution, but just to remember that in 1980, only 20% of the world's children were vaccinated. Only 20% of the world's children experienced information about breastfeeding, had their children routinely monitored for growth, and had access to medication for acute diarrheal diseases. There was then 10 years of a real global drive called the Child Survival Revolution that led to a massive expansion of all of those services globally. I'm calling for a child development revolution now, which looks at three things. I'm speeding through because I think I'm running out of time. How am I doing for time?
You're okay, Ben. 5 more minutes?
Oh, all right. I don't need to speed up then. Okay, so time for a child development revolution. Every child loved, safe, and nurtured. Building on the experience of the child survival revolution and really focusing on 3 areas of work that we need to do to ensure that every child has a primary, a secondary, and tertiary attachment. In terms of primary attachment, we need to invest in 3 things. To firstly, ensuring that we have optimum perinatal care that also helps parents to build an attachment with their child, to have a strategy for how they're going to raise the child, to think metacognitively about parenting, because attachment researchers would know that the early Bowlby and Ainsworth research showed that when parents could think about what they wanted for the child, they were much less likely to transmit insecure attachment. Secondly, family-friendly policies, including parental leave and affordable childcare. If you begin to think of attachment as the most important economic asset you have as a society, then it makes sense that across the work sector, we expand parental leave for mums and dads for as long as we can. And thirdly, and this is the real revolution, I think, is universal progressive access to parenting programs. And there was a meta-review from WHO that showed that parenting programs, home visits, are so impactful in preventing maltreatment, improving nurturing care, but also improving mental health outcomes for parents. And that's cyclical, as people know. And I just want to say that, you know, the economics of this are well explored. I was just in Ireland last week, and they had some economic modeling that their home visiting program had a $5 return on every dollar invested. Other research from Australia recently showed that digital program of parenting support also had a $5 to $6 return on investment. Of course, all of this comes from the Nobel Prize winning economist James Heckman, who created the Heckman curve, which shows that early investment gets the greatest return. He argued that the return on investment is up to $13 to $17 for each one invested, because he takes into account, I think, productivity, crime, everything else that's prevented. In terms of secondary attachment, we need universal access to schools where children are secure, safe, soothed, and seen. All of the research on education, John Hattie at University of Melbourne, who's the world leader on this, shows that relationships drive learning outcomes. So we should have relationship-based schools anyway. But children who don't feel loved at home, children who feel loved at home come to school to learn. Children who don't feel loved at home come to school to be loved, and they show it sometimes in the most complex of ways. So a relationship for every child in school, and schools that foster relationships as a core outcome of their work. And I think they'd find that their Ofsted rating would go up as well, because that drives good outcomes for children. And Melvyn Bragg, the British journalist who interviewed tens of thousands of people, said that, so many of them just say there was this teacher, I was in trouble, I was in poverty, I was affected by violence. This teacher got me on track. And I wouldn't be here today if I didn't have an amazing teacher. And this is my teacher, Jan Report. I was out of touch with her for, I think, 25 years. And I was at an event at Harvard. Somebody gave a lecture about how teachers help kids. I tracked her down, and now we're in touch. And I took my son to go and meet her. It's very hard to get kids to pose, as you know. So, but there's a picture of me with my son and my former teacher, Jan Report, who I just wouldn't be here without her. And thirdly, we need to have the target. The two things I just described are universal. We also need to strengthen targeted support for children where the risk of violence and neglect is visible and becomes known to the state. And again, relationship and outcome-based interventions that are targeted. We need to underpin all of this by ending taboo and myth and having a conversation in every community about this as a shared public health challenge. We are the first generation in history with the knowledge to end child maltreatment. We must not be we must be the last to accept it as an inevitable, insurmountable problem. Thank you, and we can do this together. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks so much, Ben. We have quite a few questions for you, and I'm sure participants online will have some stored up that they'll share in the Q&A. For now, I'm going to hand over to Carolyn.
Thanks, Awaz, and thanks, Ben. That was really interesting. So first of all, I have to say, I really enjoyed reading this book. It was really good. And obviously, having worked in children's rights really all my professional life, I'm familiar with some of the themes and findings from your research, but others were new. And it made me think about the work we do and whether there's sufficient focus on the issues raised in Trauma Proof by international donors, by the UN and by states. I know that people are going to ask a lot of questions, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I wanted to focus on a couple of issues raised by the book. Well, as you know, Coram International is dedicated to the promotion and protection of children's rights, and our work's undertaken within the framework of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Article 6 of the Convention says that states parties shall ensure to the maximum extent the survival and development of the child. And Article 4 places a duty on states to take all appropriate legislative, administrative, and other measures for the implementation of children's rights. So the right of a child to grow up in a loving environment is very much one of the basic rights. And indeed, your book is, well, at its core, about supporting parents to provide children with secure attachment for the very many reasons that you brought out and addressed. It's undoubtedly the fact that the work we do, and I think we've actually worked in 96 countries, many of them as consultants for UNICEF, it's true to say that the tide is turning. So we're moving away from putting in place a child protection system that responds to violence to preventing that violence and preventing separation of children from their parents. But in our experience, support for families is not really seen so much in terms of supporting parenting. Rather, it's focused on social protection. And what we tend to deem as social protection is about providing material help in the form of cash transfers to address poverty. Poverty being seen as one of the major issues in terms of child protection. And a large amount of money has gone into encouraging states and a lot of energy into encouraging states to provide cash transfers for mothers and babies, and in some instances for older children. And that addresses some of the issues raised by you, Ben, in that it allows mothers to spend time with and care for their babies in those early years without that pressing need to get back into work or back into selling in the market to ensure they've got enough income to feed and shelter themselves. But there are problems with social protection. First of all, the amounts are often very small and they're often very time limited. But there's little consideration given to other needs that you have raised. So for instance, there's not much attention, in my experience, looking at social protection programs, given to the relationship between parents and children. There's very little support with parenting, especially in those really important early months and years, or to assisting mothers who suffer from postnatal depression. I mean, that's almost a non-issue in most of the countries that we work with, as is domestic violence, as is learning how to cope with having a child to care for, in addition to all the other responsibilities that mothers and indeed fathers have to cope with. Having said that, we have seen some really interesting programs. We're just wrapping up work in Thailand on reform of the child protection services, where they decentralized child protection down to the communities. And at the lowest government level, what they call the sub-districts, is a bit like wards or boroughs. There are health volunteers. They are members of the community who visit families to provide advice on how to care for their children, as well as the elderly. And each of those health volunteers has 15 families for whom they're responsible and visit regularly. And they support parents to vaccinate their children, give them some help on how to care for a baby or a child with disability. And if there are issues that they can't handle, they can move them on to the coordinator of the health volunteers, who will look for support. Or if it's really a child protection issue, then they in turn can refer the case on for support from the province. And we found similar programs in Tanzania, again with community volunteers, older women who are sort of grandmas, mentor grandmoms, who go in and assist mothers and babies with parenting. And I was thinking, in terms of your book, well, how successful are these schemes? And I think they owe a lot to providing assistance from the same communities. So they're not authority figures going in and telling mothers, you must do this or you must do that, but they're very much attuned to the cultural and gender issues faced by these women. They've been through it themselves and they know what the difficulties are. Which brings me to my next point, which relates to parenting programs. And from our work, just like the mega analysis done, these programs appear to be really successful, and they tend to be well liked by parents, and they're good at addressing social norms which are harmful to children, and able to teach parents how to look after their children in a way that promotes attachment. However, the difficulty in many cases relates to getting parents to attend these programs. In a way, those who are willing to attend are not necessarily the parents that you most want to reach. Many don't see the value of such programs, saying, well, they're too busy, they've got to go to work, or they have to earn money to sustain them, and they don't have time to attend. For others, you know, the classes are during the day, particularly in developed countries, and so they're at work, they really cannot find the time. Some in rural settings find transport difficult, or there are some who see parenting programs as a stigma. Their neighbours or their community might see them attending this program and assume that there's something wrong with this woman and that she doesn't know how to parent. So even though parenting programs are becoming very much more known and common, and we know that there's a good success rate, the unanswered question for many states is when they should be offered. How do we make such programs easily accessible to people? And how do we get parents to engage and attend, and especially men? So I hope you'll come back to me on that. Lastly, I wanted to touch on something you haven't mentioned, but which I found really interesting. And that's your chapter on collective trauma. So you write about the impact on children of historic injustices, and you discuss three groups of children: child survivors of the Holocaust, children whose families were slaves in America, and the forced removal of American Indian children from their parents and the placement of such children in boarding schools which sought to eradicate that culture and teach them white Western culture. In each of those cases, children were separated from their parents, and for many, the period of separation was long, and for some, it was permanent. And for children who did return to their families, there was a problem. Bonding was difficult. The parent often no longer resembled the parent of the child's memory, and the parent themselves had changed in that time of difficulty and separation. The problem of rebuilding relationships between children and parents who fall into that historic injustice cases also includes other groups of children. I was thinking about children who were evacuated and separated from their parents during the Second World War, or lots of other armed conflicts, and how that led to an understanding, rather belatedly, but perhaps starting in the 70s, that it wasn't in the best interests of children to evacuate them on their own, and that what they really needed was a parent with them to ensure their well-being. So all of that brings me to the question: how does this information, learning, evidence relate to our work on deinstitutionalization of children? So we know that in Eastern and Central European countries, for instance, if they seek accession to the EU, and most of them do, they are required to deinstitutionalize children from large children's homes as part of the accession process. They're required to change the way they deal with placements for children who need alternative care. And over the last 10 years, many of those countries have made really significant strides in closing down large institutions. We see the same in African countries and Southeast Asia. Again, they're under significant pressure to deinstitutionalize and to close their children's homes. And it made me wonder when I read that chapter whether the issues for children as a result of collective trauma also apply to children who've been taken into care or who were placed voluntarily into care and are now being deinstitutionalized and reunified with families. Because reunification, reintegration is a big mantra. And in many of the countries where we work, deinstitutionalization takes place at short notice, and there's very little consultation or preparation for that process. And children may have been living in those children's homes for some years. They may have had very few familial visits, often due to the distance and discouragement from visiting. They quite often have strong links with other children in the children's home, and quite often are in significantly better material conditions than the parent is going to be able to offer on reunification. And we know that deinstitutionalization is often accompanied by a care package. You know, again, this is very much focused on money and material goods, but it's very rarely accompanied by counseling or a parenting program for the family before the children come back to them. And very little attention, if any, I have to say, on healthy and secure reattachment between the child and the parents. So we looked quite closely at that in Cambodia, where the political imperative, supported by international funding, was to close the children's home and reunify these children with their family. The view being, well, you know, they still have at least one or both parents, so they don't need to be here. We followed up with 200 children who'd been deinstitutionalized, either directly to their birth family or a kinship carer. And interestingly, around 3/4 of those 200 children said, at the place I'm living, there's a caregiver or some other adult who really cares about me. That's good, but it's 3/4, not 100%. Only 2/3 of the children felt confident or good about themselves, and only 50% felt safer on reunification than they had done in the children's home. perhaps unlike your experience. And overall, girls expressed lower levels of well-being once they were reunified than boys, and were more likely to be exposed to levels of violence. So I suppose, what do we learn from this? I don't have any answers to these questions, but I'm wondering, as a result of this book, whether we should require parents or family members to undertake a program on building attachment to their children before we reunify them, and how do we encourage states to take on this role? And I think it really made me think, are we doing the right thing here? You know, are we really prepping the children and their families? And do we really need to look very differently at these issues? So in conclusion, I would say, Ben, my highest praise on this book, because you did a thing that I really like about the book, which is you made me think. And for that, I'm grateful and I really enjoyed it. So back over to you, Awaz.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and to Ben. And I think we've got lots of questions in the chat box. And if I may, I will start with the question about the universal provision of parenting support, and picking up on Carolyn's point that very often, well, as a universal service, these are often voluntary schemes. And as Carolyn highlighted, there's often a reluctance to attend, or parents have work commitments. So what are some of the practical things that we can do to address that?
I think because of that, and also because of the hidden prevalence of adversity, the only solution we've got is to make this a universal service, right? Universal progressive. So everybody gets a minimum package of home visits, maybe supplemented by or instead or you know, alongside group sessions or digital tools, and that those who need more get more. So when people ask me, well, like one of the things that happens when I go and this happened in Ireland last week when I'm giving a keynote, I'm talking about the book, and there's somebody there that works with addicts, and he just said, well, parents won't take up the program. And I completely understood and identified, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a child development revolution where this thing becomes a norm. People refuse to go to school. Most people, if you get this, in the generation before the boomer generation, didn't go to school. All the boomer generation went to school. That took a revolution in public education. So I think that we're looking for the same with child development because of the science we know. However, we also know that parenting programs are often very, very popular, and the improvements on mental health of parents, which was a side benefit, not an intended outcome, is something that I think is a real indicator of what parents, including parents in distress or single teenage parents, get out of this. And the more a parent learns to connect and bond with the child, the better they feel about being a parent. And that in itself is a revolution, even if you're in the midst of poverty. So in humanitarian situations, we do support parenting programs as well, because they help parents to provide the buffer, and they give parents focus and purpose in protecting their children. And that is uplifting, I think. Do you want me to answer the bit about cultural, or are you going to ask me the question about cultural differences?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the neurobiology of every child is the same, but they grow up in completely different cultural contexts. We're lucky, for example, in high-income countries that we have lots of access to parenting knowledge, but we're unlucky that we often live in atomized families where we don't have broader support. Research from parts of the global south has shown recently that allo parenting, which is the idea that kids have an attachment relationship with the parents, but also the friends and the community and other people pick up the child and soothe them at different times, and that's okay as well in that context. We also know that carrying babies in a pouch, which I did with my son and loved it in his first year, is also incredibly good for attachment. So these are ideas coming from the global south. So we have to get the best of ideas from different places and make them universal where we can. But we also have to get really uber capitalist societies like United States in particular, free market driven societies, to recognize that it takes a village to raise a child, and sometimes the situation we put kids into is not good for their health, even if we think we're at the pinnacle of economic and social progress. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And going back to Carolyn's question about the finding that much of the support in parenting programs has been on supporting women to care for their children.
Yeah.
And in your view, should there be more focus on fathers, and what form should this take?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a revolution in fathering as well, right? Because you have so many parents in high income countries, for example, that are spending much more time with their kids that they're used to, and they're loving it. You know, like all the guys that I know at preschool, Montessori, that we all love being a parent. It's the best thing we ever did. And so I think there's a lot of potential there for parenting programs and parental leave to be much more equitable. There's research on parenting programs shows that fathers often respond better to group sessions with other dads, or group settings like preschool that I just described that pick up. I think also that fathers like it to be part of a broader set of skills. So putting in parenting programs with a broader set of family and financial skills is, I think, another way that works. I think also parental leave should be done as a package for both parents, where the family makes a decision about how they manage that amongst themselves. It's really important for the gestating parent to take a long period of parental leave with the child. But if you were to look at it as a package in some Scandinavian countries of 18 months, it can be split between a father and a mother in a way that they see fit. And also other constellations of families as well.
Thanks very much, Ben. And there's been a lot of interest in the chat as following on from Carolyn's comments about collective responsibility and how this relates to children in care. And on the one hand, there's Carolyn's question, are we doing the right thing in the context of DI and concerns around the lack of parenting support during that process, but also noting the questions in the chat about how to build secure attachments while children are in care. And the related question, do children in foster care tend to have better outcomes than children in residential settings?
Yeah, these are great questions. In a child development revolution context, you have the outcome is that every child has a strong primary, secondary, and tertiary attachment. So if you are running a care system with that in mind, as you should, as we should, then of course you would always make sure that all of the things that are required to provide the child with that in all circumstances are in place. If we had that in the UK, maybe children in care wouldn't be the most human rights violated part of our society, which they are. So I think that's clear that we need to think about the emotional world of the child. All of our systems, the way schooling ignores play as a central element of childhood, the way that institutions ignore trauma. I mean, I think we need to build all institutions that serve children and build our societies around the emotional as well as the physical needs of a human being. I think that's really important. I just want to say that one other thing that you haven't asked me about, but it's really one. I thought about it when I thought about your question. In the Holocaust, in slavery, in the suppression of the indigenous populations around the world, in Stalinism, it was a tactic and a strategy of totalitarian regimes or criminals to sever the attachment relationship between the parent and the child. Like slavery was built on the idea that you take most people that came on a slave ship were teenagers, and they were taken away from their family and their community and sent off on a slave ship. And so I think that we understand the value of attachment when we understand how much those who would do us harm want to take it away from us. That's just a thought that came out. Yeah.
Thank you. If I could just move on to sort of more macro level comments. I think at Coram International, we're often involved in supporting the development of systems more broadly, and participants online may also be involved in this work. So when we talk about this addressing child trauma, it sort of involves a bit more than what we traditionally think of as a public health response, and it requires the involvement of education, of social welfare sectors, as well as health and others. How, in your view, can we bridge the gap between these sectors, and how realistic is it to do this at a global level and at a national level?
Just one thing, yeah, brilliant question. From my side, when I think public health, what I'm really talking about is population level intervention, where you have a baseline and a target, and you try to reach everybody in the society and have progress that's ongoing. So it doesn't need to just be the health sector. In fact, it needs to be schools, social work systems, and the whole of the workplace, the whole of society. I just think that societies evolve and in progress when they take the available science to achieve the goals and targets they would have for themselves. And we're at this new stage in history where we have all this understanding about the neurobiological development of the child, so we can just transform society for the better, the way that people who introduced vaccines to schools in the previous century did. So I think that getting organizations to work around outcomes that, we want to, if we can now be serious about eradicating substance abuse disorders or eradicating vulnerability to crime or the risk of trafficking. If we want to, if we have this area of work that is a force multiplier for multiple positive outcomes across society, we need to just really rebuild our institutions a little bit to reflect that, maintaining what's strong and what works and adding more into it. We had austerity was a backward step. And we continue to have backward steps. You remember the Sure Start, which was really a child revolution type, development revolution type of intervention, was rolled back. And I think we need to recognize the value of all of this work and then build our institutions around it in a way that gets them to collaborate. Kate Forbes, who's the MSP and the senior SNP politician, I feature her in a chapter, and she had postnatal depression, which she very bravely talks about. And she tells me about the way in Scotland, the home visitor was plugged into the doctor and they were plugged into the mental health services. People fought a war for us to have this kind of support, right? The National Health Service as a system, people fought and died for us to have that kind of progress. And I think in honor of them, when we have new science and breakthroughs that tells us how we can improve society for this generation and for the next generation, we just need to make it happen. And I think that we can, as long as we focus on outcomes and impacts.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go back to one of the questions actually that was in the chat, because I think we sort of touched upon it, Ben, but maybe I think we can address it a bit more further. So it's from Mathilde Gunzberger, who thanks you for the impressive presentation and fully relates to the findings and priorities for the current and the next generation. And her question is about trauma in a culturally diverse world, and our diverse understanding of what constitutes trauma and how people with various resilience and cultural backgrounds respond to it. And her question is enough being done in our sector to address this, given that trauma science comes from the North mainly? So if you have any thoughts about this.
I think a lot of research on things like parenting programs that were in the WHO review is also coming from Global South. I think that we know that adverse child experience surveys have similar levels of adversity across the Global South and the Global North. We know that violence against children surveys that take place primarily in the Global South also have similar prevalence rates. In some countries where they've had very robust maltreatment prevention than in the north, like I think Scandinavian countries. Then you have a lower level. We also notice that in some countries where physical punishment is outlawed, that verbal violence increases. So we've got a kind of a complex picture, but we have enough knowledge to understand that the primary risk factor for trauma, which is abuse, neglect, dysfunctional parenting, is prevalent across societies. We have enough to act. Like if I ask people at like I work at the UN and with WHO, and we are very much a global workforce and global scientists and using global research and trying to find global solutions, that are relevant in different parts of the world, particularly in the global south. And I think that we generally feel that we have enough science to act. But what's really important is that whatever's delivered is responding to the same neurobiology in any part of the world, the same way a vaccine would, but is delivered in a completely different cultural, in a culturally appropriate way. And often recognizing that people in different cultural contexts draw on different sources of support to address or manage trauma. But I think you'll find the issue of like taboo and how difficult it is to talk about this is as prevalent in the global south as in the global north, sometimes more so. And I think one of the things that's really important is that in the continent of Africa, I think it's something like 2 mental health workers per 100,000 population. However, you've got projects like the Friendship Bench, which is a brilliant project in South Africa and Zimbabwe, which just somebody alluded to something similar earlier on. Carolyn alluded to something similar earlier on, where you get grandparents to speak to people about their problems, and that really works in that cultural context. We need a lot more exploration of that. Not a brilliant answer, but yeah.
That's fantastic, Ben. And this has been asked a couple of times about whether you address trauma for unaccompanied and asylum-seeking children who may have seen horrific events, such as family being killed or harmed.
I don't separate the different, neurobiologically, somebody that's affected by incest in London, or somebody that's an asylum seeker that's in a war, or somebody that's been completely abandoned by their parents in New York. Biological reality is the same. We have this tendency in our political context to try to differentiate between different groups, but the trauma impact is the same across vulnerabilities. If children don't feel safe or loved or nurtured, they're at very high risk of trauma, which makes them vulnerable to more trauma. And I think that's across. So I do use some examples. I use examples from Jamaica, South Africa, different parts of the world, but I don't think I have a specific story about unaccompanied children. I do actually, because I talk about Holocaust children. So yeah, I kind of do in that chapter, but I think the solutions and responses are similar in many ways. Yeah.
Thanks so much. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask a final question. And in your book, Ben, you mention, and in the presentation, you mention that the child survival revolution happened at a very politically challenging time during the 1980s, and politics isn't an excuse not to act. And this relates also to the question from Satwinder Sandhu. Thank you for your question, Satwinder. Is that how can we make governments listen? So any advice that you have for us as researchers, as practitioners, how can we help support this agenda?
I think we have to be really clear. What are the 3 things we can do right now that science will tell us have the biggest impact on ensuring child development and child protection? That's the first thing. Secondly, remind politicians of their legacy. This is a legacy issue in the same way child survival revolution was for others. And thirdly, be a conscientious objector to culture wars, because that just creates a massive smoke screen. People that want to do real positive change in the world, human rights-based change, are not doing culture wars because it's just a waste of time and a distraction. So trying to get politicians to focus on real outcomes that are within reach for us.
Thank you so much. I think that is probably an excellent note to end with. Thank you so much to you, Ben, and to Carolyn, and for all the participants online. This is a recorded session, so you will be able to see it afterwards. And I wish you all an enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.